don't say that, guy, but we cannot lose the war. That was not even remotely in my mind that we ever could lose a war, you know. We listened to the news and they told us all about going on in the Western Front and how successful they are and all that.
For more than 80 years, these photographs lay hidden, unseen by the world. They were taken not by historians or journalists, but by the very soldiers who marched through villages, burned homes, and buried their own dead. These images are not propaganda. They are fragments of truth, raw and unsettling, showing war exactly as it was lived in the summer of 1941.
They said, do you want to go to a jet pilot training school? If we go in the column over there, they're serious and they're going to mow us down. So, but if you go one guy every 100 feet, they may not even pay attention to us.
Behind every destroyed bridge, every scorched home, and every simple grave lies a story too often forgotten. Some photographs can completely change how we see history. For more than 80 years, a collection of images sat hidden away, taken not by professional war correspondents, but by ordinary German soldiers during the summer of 1941. These were not meant for propaganda posters or official reports. They were personal records, snapshots of a war unfolding in real time. What makes them stand out is their raw honesty. They do not present carefully staged victories or dramatic poses. Instead, they show the war as it really was in its earliest, most chaotic days on the Eastern Front. By 1941, Nazi Germany had already reshaped much of Europe. Poland had been invaded and carved up with astonishing speed in 1939. France, despite its long history as a powerful military state, collapsed within 6 weeks in 1940. Other countries across Europe, from the Low Countries to the Balkans, also fell under German control. This series of victories gave Hitler and his generals a sense of unstoppable momentum. Germany's military machine appeared invincible, with its fast-moving armored divisions and coordinated airstrikes creating what the world came to know as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was against this backdrop that Hitler turned his eyes eastward. On the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa began, the largest military invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by allies, crossed into Soviet territory. At first, it looked like just another campaign that would end in a swift and decisive German triumph. The early weeks were marked by rapid advances, encircled Soviet units, and tens of thousands of prisoners. German commanders wrote in their diaries that the campaign could be over in a matter of weeks. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, recorded in July 1941 that victory was essentially already secured. But behind the optimistic reports and confident predictions, the photographs tell a more complex story. Many of the images come from Belarus, taken in the opening phase of the invasion. The photographer is believed to have been part of the 7th Panzer Division, one of Germany's mechanized units. The division had been formed after the Polish campaign in 1939, reorganized from a light division into a more mobile panzer force. It carried the reputation of being an effective fighting unit, and its insignia and equipment can be recognized in several of the surviving photos. The images capture both the machinery and the men of the invasion. One photograph shows a column of specialized flamethrower tanks, the Flampanzer II, nicknamed Flamingo. These were adapted versions of light tanks, fitted with flamethrowers to flush enemy soldiers out of defensive positions. Another image shows a soldier peering through a pair of stereoscopic binoculars, often called rabbit ears, because of their distinctive shape. Such equipment was essential for spotting Soviet positions in the vast, open terrain. The division entered the Soviet Union with around 400 officers and 14,000 enlisted men. At this early stage of the campaign, morale was high. Soldiers advanced quickly, often covering 15 to 30 kilometers per day. Columns of tanks and trucks rolled through fields and villages, while foot soldiers marched alongside. In some places, the advance moved hundreds of kilometers in just weeks. It seemed as though Hitler's gamble of opening another front while still at war with Britain might actually succeed. But the photographs reveal more than just movement and machinery. They also capture the human side of war. One shows German soldiers gathered at a comrade's grave, a simple birch cross marked with helmets and names scrawled across wood. Even in the first months, German units were taking casualties, and losses were felt deeply among soldiers who had expected an easier fight. Another picture shows a tanker studying a map on the roadside, emphasizing how fluid and uncertain the front lines could be. Rest stops were not moments of comfort but opportunities to regroup, plan, and press on. Some photos show officers in tents, drawing up orders and planning their next movements. Others capture quieter moments, soldiers lying down asleep wherever they could find space, or writing letters to families back home. A radio operator is pictured during a rare pause in fighting, his equipment beside him. These glimpses of ordinary life within extraordinary circumstances make the photographs more than just military records. They remind us that the war was lived day by day, with a mix of exhaustion, duty, and routine. Bridges were often destroyed by retreating Soviet forces to slow the German advance. One striking image shows troops standing at the remains of a blown-up bridge, staring at the wreckage that blocked their path. In another, a Soviet train loaded with tanks sits abandoned, its cargo never reaching the front lines. These details highlight the scale of the Soviet retreat, but they also show that the Red Army was not giving up without resistance. By destroying infrastructure and equipment, Soviet forces were trading space for time, hoping to stretch the German supply lines thin. At the strategic level, Hitler had believed that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly under pressure. He assumed the Soviet leadership was weak, its army poorly trained, and its people unwilling to fight. In the first weeks of the invasion, those assumptions seemed correct. But the further German troops pushed into Soviet territory, the more they discovered that victory would not come so easily. Logistics became harder. Roads turned into mud during summer rains. Supply convoys struggled to keep up, and while the Red Army suffered enormous losses, it continued to regroup and counterattack. Looking back at these photographs today, what stands out is the mixture of confidence and vulnerability. German soldiers, many still in high spirits, posed for pictures, explored captured villages, and marched forward with determination. But already there were signs that the campaign was not as simple as they had hoped. Graves marked the cost of every advance. Destroyed infrastructure and scorched villages showed the difficulties of sustaining momentum. And the sheer size of the Soviet Union meant that every kilometer gained brought new challenges. These images, taken in Belarus in the summer of 1941, offer a perspective rarely captured in official accounts. They show both the speed of the German invasion and the cracks beginning to appear in the plan. While the commanders believed in a rapid victory, the photographs suggest something more complex, a war that even in its earliest days carried the seeds of prolonged struggle and unimaginable loss. When we study these photographs, we are reminded that history is not just about victories and defeats recorded in books. It is about the human experience of those caught in the middle. For the soldiers of the 7th Panzer Division, the summer of 1941 may have felt like the beginning of another triumph. For the Soviet defenders, it was the start of a desperate fight for survival. And for us today, these hidden images help us see beyond the simplified stories of the past, offering a more honest view of how the war really began on the Eastern Front. As the German advance continued deeper into Soviet territory, the photographs shifted focus from tanks and columns to the everyday realities of both soldiers and civilians. These images show how war was not only fought on the battlefield, but also lived in villages, fields, and makeshift camps. The summer of 1941 was a time of rapid conquest, yet it was also marked by the constant collision of two worlds, the invading army and the local population trying to survive. One set of photographs captures German soldiers arriving in Belarusian villages. Wooden houses stood along dirt roads, with thatched roofs and smoke rising from chimneys. The presence of German vehicles and troops among these simple rural scenes is striking. Sometimes the villages were intact, their residents continuing daily routines even as the front lines rolled past. In other places, the photographs reveal scorched buildings and burnt-out homes, evidence of Soviet attempts to deny shelter or supplies to the ordinary life continued in fragments. Women are seen threshing wheat in open fields, their work unchanged in method but changed in meaning, now performed under occupation. Children appear in some images, standing alongside German soldiers, a stark reminder that war touches the youngest as well as the old. Elderly men can also be seen, many of them left behind while younger men were conscripted by the Soviet mobilization. At first, the Red Army only drafted those under the age of 36, but as the scale of the conflict grew, the draft age expanded to include men up to 51. These photographs reveal the early gap between the soldiers at the front and the families left in the villages. For the German soldiers, daily life was not a constant march forward but a rhythm of movement and pause. Several images capture men resting, some asleep on the ground, others writing letters or reading military newspapers. One soldier, pictured wearing only his underwear, reads from the Panzerfaust, a propaganda publication distributed to boost morale. Another plays music while comrades listen, part of an improvised military orchestra. These moments of ordinary leisure exist, side by side with scenes of destruction, giving the photos a strangely human and unsettling balance. We also see images of officers gathered around maps, planning their next moves, or radio operators transmitting orders from inside simple canvas tents. Communication, rest, and organization were as crucial as firepower. Without them, the rapid advances of the first weeks would have ground to a halt. The photographs remind us that behind every fast-moving division were men who had to plan, eat, sleep, and sometimes even try to find normality amid chaos. Yet the villages also reveal the harsh realities of occupation. One photo shows a German soldier walking through a settlement that has been burned to the ground. In another, troops stand beside a destroyed bridge, evidence of the Red Army's scorched earth tactics. Retreating Soviet forces destroyed bridges, railways, and supplies to make the German advance as difficult as possible. A Soviet train loaded with tanks was photographed abandoned, never reaching its intended battlefield. Such destruction was intended to slow the German pace, and it often forced them to improvise with repairs, pontoon bridges, or simple detours. Among the most telling photographs are those showing interactions between villagers and occupying soldiers. In one, what appears to be a kind of town meeting takes place, with both Germans and Belarusians present. The war did not halt daily life, instead it reshaped it. Local families had to feed themselves but also provide for the foreign troops suddenly living among them. Women baked bread, worked the fields, and tried to keep households functioning under new demands. Civilians had little choice but to adapt, even as their resources were stretched thin. Not every moment captured was grim. Some images even show soldiers amused by local oddities, such as a taxidermy bear tied to a lamppost, likely taken from a museum. Others depict men riding bicycles or horses, an image that challenges the popular view of the Wehrmacht as a fully mechanized modern army. In reality, the German forces relied heavily on foot soldiers, horse-drawn wagons, and bicycles. Historians have pointed out that over 90% of German units were standard infantry divisions with limited motorization. The photographs of soldiers pedaling through villages or leading horses with supplies underscore this fact. This reliance on older methods of transport had significant implications. While tanks and trucks captured attention, the logistics of supplying millions of men across vast Soviet distances depended on slower, less reliable means. Horses remained essential for moving artillery and supplies. Bicycles were used by infantry units and as couriers, both by the Germans and the Red Army. These images serve as a reminder that modern war often still leans on older traditions of movement and transport. The photographs also shed light on the psychological side of the soldiers. In some, they appear relaxed, chatting, or smiling. In others, they look weary, staring blankly into the distance or resting wherever they could. Not every man in the Wehrmacht was a committed Nazi. Some were conscripts who joined out of duty, pressure, or fear. While many believed in Hitler's promises of a quick war, others simply wanted to return home alive. These nuances are rarely visible in official histories but are suggested in the candidness of the photographs. Scenes of destroyed villages and burnt homes highlight the human cost for civilians. In one town, only stone stoves remain standing where entire houses once stood. In the ruins, everyday objects such as a frying pan still hang on what is left of a wall. These small haunting details bring home the impact of invasion, the erasure of normal life in moments. One photo shows a German column moving through a heavily damaged town, even on horseback, past the ruins of an old church. Before the war, the church had already been closed by Soviet authorities and repurposed into a garage as part of their campaign against religion. War layered new destruction onto old struggles, leaving behind a complex legacy of loss. Through these images we see both the speed of conquest and the beginning of the burdens that came with it. German soldiers advanced further into Soviet territory, but the strain on resources, the destruction left behind by retreating forces, and the sheer size of the land hinted at the challenges ahead. For civilians, the war meant survival under constant change, feeding, occupying soldiers, working in fields, and watching their homes disappear in flames. In many ways, this middle section of the photographs shows war stripped of grand strategy and reduced to the daily grind of existence. Soldiers resting by the roadside, villagers threshing wheat, bridges blown apart, and bicycles rolling through villages tell the story of how both sides coped with the relentless pace of events. These were the ordinary details of an extraordinary conflict, reminders that war is lived not only in battles but also in every moment of adaptation, endurance, and survival. As the photographs progress, the tone begins to shift. What starts as a record of swift advances and occupied villages gradually turns into a reminder of the heavy cost of war. By late summer 1941, the images reflect not just movement forward but also the mounting losses and the realities of a campaign that was far from easy. One of the recurring themes is the presence of graves. Simple wooden crosses, often marked with helmets or scrawled names, appear again and again. Some show individual burials, while others capture entire cemeteries set up in Soviet villages. These photographs remind us that even during the early months of Operation Barbarossa, when German propaganda spoke of quick victories, soldiers on the ground were already facing death on a large scale. Every kilometer gained required sacrifice, and the photographs are silent evidence of that price. Destroyed Soviet tanks and artillery also feature prominently. The T-26, a light tank based on an older British design, was the most widely used in the Red Army at the time. Many of these vehicles appear wrecked or abandoned along roadsides and in fields. In one image, soldiers pose next to heavy howitzers left behind by retreating Soviet troops. These sights reinforced the German perception that they were winning, but the sheer volume of destroyed equipment also revealed the scale of the conflict. The Soviet Union had the capacity to replace losses quickly, and the further the Germans advanced, the more equipment they faced. The photographs also challenge some of the stereotypes about the German army. Rather than rows of powerful trucks and endless tanks, many images show soldiers on bicycles or leading horses. Supply wagons, field kitchens, and artillery pieces were still dependent on animal power. Even though Germany had developed advanced weapons and efficient tactics, its logistics were tied to methods that had not changed much since the First World War. This reliance slowed the pace of operations and stretched resources thin across the vast distances of the Soviet Union. In some of the images we see captured Soviet prisoners. A few photographs even show German soldiers giving water or medical care to wounded captives. While it is true that smaller groups of prisoners sometimes received humane treatment early in the campaign, the broader history tells us that millions of Soviet prisoners later faced starvation, disease, and death in German custody. The photographs provide a glimpse into the more complex and contradictory nature of war, where moments of compassion could coexist with policies of brutality. Bridges appear repeatedly in the series. Many had been blown up by retreating Soviet forces, forcing the Germans to rely on pontoon bridges to cross rivers. These temporary structures appear alongside the ruins of older bridges, a visual reminder of how the Soviets tried to slow the advance. In some photos, destroyed trains and wrecked equipment can be seen across riverbanks, emphasizing the destructive retreat strategy the Soviets adopted. The story of the 219th Infantry Division, visible in several of the photographs, reflects the larger fate of the German invasion. From August 1941 to January 1942, this division alone lost 10,000 men. By 1942, it found itself encircled in what became known as the Demien's Pocket, suffering catastrophic losses. By March 1943, the division had been reduced to barely 1,200 men, less than 10% of its original strength. Though reorganized, it continued retreating westward with the rest of the army until it finally surrendered to Soviet forces in Latvia in 1945. The photographs of bicycles, graves, and weary soldiers foreshadow this decline, even if at the time the men believed they were still advancing toward victory. Aircraft also appear in some of the photos, including the Junkers Ju-80, one of the Luftwaffe's most widely used planes. These glimpses of air power remind us that the invasion was not just fought on the ground. Yet, even with support from the air, the German forces could not overcome the sheer scale of the Soviet. What had seemed like unstoppable progress in the summer of 1941 would eventually stall as supply lines stretched, weather worsened, and Soviet resistance stiffened. The final photographs in the collection return to occupied towns and villages. In one, German soldiers are seen walking past a statue of Lenin. In another, the ruins of homes stand as silent witnesses to the destruction. Soldiers can be seen peeling potatoes or sitting in groups, their expressions tired, their bodies worn down. These images highlight how quickly the atmosphere of triumph turned into a daily grind for survival. By the end of 1941, it was clear that the German campaign would not be the quick victory Hitler had promised. The Soviets had absorbed terrible losses, but they had not surrendered. Instead, the front lines stabilized as winter set in, and the war that had begun with such speed became a prolonged, brutal struggle. The photographs leave us with a deeper understanding of this moment in history. They capture not just the weapons and strategies, but the people who lived through it. The soldiers who advanced and buried their comrades, the civilians who endured occupation, and the landscapes that bore the scars of destruction. They also remind us how quickly confidence can turn to hardship, and how the reality of war is often far from the stories told in official accounts. Looking back, we can see that the summer of 1941 was both the height of German power and the beginning of its decline. The invasion of the Soviet Union opened a conflict so vast that it would eventually consume the German army itself. These photographs, hidden for decades, offer us an unfiltered view of that turning point, a chance to see the war as it truly unfolded rather than how it was later remembered.